It was upon a particularly dreary morning in late November that the singular case I'm about to recount first presented itself at our lodgings in Baker Street, London. Lay beneath a blanket of cold gray fog. The sort of fog, I may add, that crept through every crack and crevice of the city, muffling the clatter of carriage wheels and lending even the most ordinary street corner an air of foreboding mystery. The lamps along Baker Street burned pale yellow through the mist, and the faint smell of coal smoke drifted into our sitting room at 221B. Holmes had been in one of his reflective moods for the better part of 3 days, too. The casual observer such periods might appear to be indolence. Indeed, I had once known an officer of Scotland Yard to describe my friend as the laziest man in London. Yet, one knew well that during these quiet intervals his mind moved with extraordinary intensity. That morning I found him seated in his customary armchair beside the fireplace. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his sharp, hawk-like profile illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. He had not moved for nearly 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the scratching of my pen as I worked upon a medical paper concerning the treatment of traumatic nerve injuries among soldiers, an interest which remained with me long after my service in Afghanistan. At length Holmes spoke without shifting his position. "Watson," said he quietly, "how long has the post been delayed this morning?" I glanced toward the mantel clock. "Nearly an hour beyond its usual time." "Precisely," he murmured. "And yet the fog is no heavier than yesterday. Curious. You believe there is significance in that?" I asked. Holmes turned his head slightly and regarded me with a faint smile. "My dear Watson, in London the absence of routine is very often more revealing than routine itself." Before I could inquire further, we heard footsteps ascending the stairs, and a moment later our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, entered the room carrying a small parcel. "There's a delivery for you, Mr. Holmes," said she. Her tone held the slightest trace of unease. Holmes rose at once. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." She placed the parcel upon the table and withdrew. With a small nod, I examined the object with idle curiosity. It was a rectangular box wrapped in dark brown paper and bound neatly with black string. No return address appeared upon it. Though Holmes' name had been written in a precise hand, Holmes stood over the parcel without touching it. That alone struck me as remarkable. I had seen my friend open letters containing threats, poison powders, and once even a live snake concealed within a hat box. Yet never had I known him to hesitate. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. Instead of answering, he leaned closer and studied the wrapping with intense concentration. "The handwriting," he said at last. "You observe it, Watson?" I leaned forward. The script was elegant and deliberate. "It seems perfectly ordinary." Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Watson, not ordinary." He tapped one long finger beside the address. "Observe the spacing between the letters, the careful suppression of individual flourish. It is the work of a man who normally writes with considerable character but is now attempting to conceal it. A disguise." "Precisely." Holmes circled the parcel once, examining it from every angle. "What do you make of the string?" he asked. "Black twine. Quite common." Holmes smiled faintly. "Common, perhaps, yet tied in a sailor's knot. A habit rarely found among London tradesmen." I confess the deduction left me none the wiser. "Then the sender is a sailor." Holmes shook his head again. "No, the sender wishes us to believe he is a sailor." He lifted the parcel at last and weighed it in his hand. Approximately 1 pound in weight. A rigid object within. Possibly metal. He placed it gently back upon the table. I noticed something unusual then. Holmes' expression had changed. For perhaps the first time since I had known him, I detected something bordering upon reluctance. "You have not opened it," I said. "No, why not?" Holmes stared at the parcel for several seconds before answering. "Because, Watson," he said quietly, "there are only two reasons a man sends a parcel anonymously. And those are: either he wishes to surprise the recipient, or he wishes to frighten him. And this one frightens you." Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. "My dear Watson, very little frightens me." He paused. "But this," he said slowly, "is something different." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "Do you recognize the sender?" Holmes turned toward the window where the fog pressed thick against the glass. "I believe," he said at last, "that I recognize the intention. And what is that?" Holmes' voice dropped to a whisper. "To remind me of something I had hoped never to see again." At that very moment the door burst open and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard hurried into the room. His face flushed from the cold. "Holmes!" he exclaimed. "Ah, Lestrade," said Holmes calmly. "You arrive at a most interesting moment." Lestrade removed his hat and glanced between us. "There's been a murder," said he. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "Bloomsbury. And what possible connection could that have with my Morning Post?" Lestrade hesitated. "Because," he said slowly, "the victim was found holding a card." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "What card?" Lestrade reached into his coat and placed a small rectangle of paper upon the table beside the parcel. I picked it up. Upon it were written just 6 words: "For Sherlock Holmes. Do not open." Holmes stared at the parcel again, and for the first time in my acquaintance with him, I saw genuine concern in his eyes. "Inspector." Lestrade's revelation hung in the air like the lingering echo of a gunshot. For several seconds, none of us spoke. The small card lay upon the table beside the mysterious parcel, its stark message seeming to absorb the light of the room. "For Sherlock Holmes, do not open." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Well," said he impatiently, "are you going to explain what all this means?" Holmes had returned to the armchair by the fire. His long frame appeared relaxed, yet I knew that this apparent indifference was merely the outer shell of a mind working at prodigious speed. "My dear Lestrade," said Holmes calmly, "you have brought me a puzzle of considerable interest." "That's not the word I'd use," the inspector muttered. Holmes gestured toward the parcel. "You say the murdered man held a card identical to this." "Exactly the same message," said Lestrade. "Same handwriting, too. And the victim." Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Name of Edward Carstairs. A dealer in rare antiques. Quite respectable from all accounts." Holmes' eyes flickered with interest. "Antiques, you say?" "Yes. And where exactly was the body discovered?" "In his shop on Bloomsbury Street." "Late last night." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And the cause of death?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "That's the strange part." Holmes leaned forward. "The strange part is always the most valuable." "There were no wounds," said Lestrade. "None? Not a mark on him." Holmes' fingers tapped lightly upon the armrest. "And yet you are certain it was murder?" Lestrade nodded. "Because the man's face?" He hesitated. "Well," Holmes urged. Lestrade spoke in a lower voice. He looked terrified, as though he'd seen something that frightened him to death. Holmes' gaze drifted slowly back to the parcel. Fascinating. I could restrain my curiosity no longer. "Holmes," I said, "surely you do not believe this package is connected with the crime?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, coincidence is the last refuge of the unimaginative." He stood and approached the table once more. Lestrade folded his arms. "Are you going to open it or not?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he withdrew a small magnifying lens from his waistcoat pocket and began inspecting the parcel, with the same meticulous care a surgeon might give to a delicate operation. "Observe here," he murmured. "Les Trade. And I leaned closer. Holmes pointed to a faint discoloration upon the wrapping. Paper, a chemical stain. What sort? I asked. Holmes sniffed the air lightly. Camphor, and something else. His expression sharpened. An embalming preservative. Lestrade's eyebrows rose. You mean something dead has been in contact with it? Precisely. He then examined the knot securing the string, as I mentioned earlier, tied by a sailor's hand. Yet the paper itself comes from a stationer in Mayfair. How can you tell that? Lestrade demanded. Holmes turned the parcel slightly. A faint watermark in the paper fibers. Lestrade scratched his head. Well, that narrows it down to half the shops in London. Holmes smiled. Not quite. Only one Mayfair stationer uses this particular brand of paper imported from Holland. And which shop is that? Pritchard & Sons, on Grosvenor Street. Lestrade whistled softly. You worked that out from the paper alone. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he produced a slim penknife from his pocket. The room seemed to grow strangely quiet. You're really going to open it? I asked. Holmes glanced at me. Double quotes, Watson, if a man wishes to frighten Sherlock Holmes. The least I can do is oblige him. With delicate precision. He slid the blade beneath the stringed out the twine fell away. Holmes then peeled back the brown paper. Inside lay a small wooden box. It was old, very old. The dark oak surface was carved with a pattern of strange geometric symbols. Holmes' face went suddenly pale. Good heavens, he whispered. I had rarely heard such words from him. What is it? I asked. Holmes did not answer. Slowly he lifted the lid. Inside the box rested a single object, a silver key. But it was not the key itself that made Lestrade recoil. It was the label tied around it. Holmes lifted the tag and read aloud. The first gift. Lestrade frowned. What does that mean? Holmes stared at the key for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. It means, said he, that whoever sent this parcel intends to give me more. More keys? Lestrade asked. Holmes shook his head. No. His eyes moved to the card again. More gifts. A sudden thought struck me. Holmes, you said earlier you recognized the intention of the sender. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, Watson. Then you know who is responsible. Holmes closed the lid of the box with deliberate care. I know someone who would find this sort of game very amusing. Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. Well, who is it? Holmes walked toward the window where the fog still rolled thick across Baker Street. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. A man who once told me that the greatest pleasure in life is not committing a crime. Holmes paused, but constructing one so intricate that only I could solve it. Lestrade frowned. You're not suggesting Holmes turned back toward us? No, he said quietly. Not him. Then who? Holmes looked again at the silver key, a far more patient adversary. At that moment, the fire crackled sharply behind us. Holmes picked up the key and turned it between his fingers. This, he said slowly, is only the first move. Lestrade groaned. Holmes, speak plainly for once. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, if I am correct, another man will be dead before nightfall. Lestrade's face went white. And the next gift, Holmes continued, will tell us where. Within the hour, Holmes, Inspector Lestrade, and I found ourselves traveling through the fog-drenched streets of London toward Bloomsbury. The city had taken on that peculiar stillness which often accompanies late autumn mornings. Horse-drawn carriages moved slowly through the mist, their lanterns glowing dimly like distant stars, while the silhouettes of pedestrians drifted past like restless spirits. Holmes remained silent during the journey, the small silver key resting in his gloved hand as he studied. It with a concentration so intense that I hesitated to interrupt his thoughts. Edward Carstairs' shop stood on a narrow street lined with respectable but aging buildings. A faded sign above the door read Carstairs and Curiosities, Antiquities, and Rare Objects. Two uniformed constables guarded the entrance, and they stepped aside at once when Lestrade approached. Inside, the shop was a labyrinth of history. Shelves overflowed with artifacts, gathered from every corner of the world: ancient Egyptian figurines, Chinese porcelain, medieval daggers, Persian rugs, and countless other relics whose stories had long since faded into obscurity. The air carried the musty scent of old wood and varnish, mingled faintly with the sharp tang of chemical preservatives. Carstairs' body had already been removed, but the position in which he had died was clearly marked upon the wooden floor behind the main counter. Holmes wasted no time. He knelt beside the chalk outline, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the surrounding area. "You say there were no signs of struggle?" Holmes asked. "None," replied Lestrade. "The door was locked from the inside, the windows untouched. Looks almost like the man simply collapsed." Holmes ran his fingertips across the wooden counter. Death rarely arrives without leaving some form of introduction. He then examined the nearby shelves with careful attention. I watched him closely, attempting as I often did to follow the chain of reasoning that guided his investigations. Yet Holmes possessed an uncanny ability to observe details so minute that they escaped the notice of ordinary men entirely. "Curious," he murmured. "What is?" I asked. Holmes pointed toward a small display cabinet near the wall. "Do you see the empty space between those artifacts?" I stepped closer. Indeed, among a collection of ancient trinkets sat a rectangular gap where something had clearly been removed. Lestrade frowned. "Probably sold before he died." Holmes shook his head. "No. Observe the dust pattern." He lifted his magnifying lens. "The surrounding objects have gathered dust for several weeks, yet the wooden surface beneath the missing piece is perfectly clean. Whatever stood there was removed very recently. Stolen." Lestrade suggested. Holmes straightened. "Possibly." He turned toward the shop's ledger resting upon the counter. The thick book contained Carstairs' records of recent transactions. Holmes flipped through several pages, scanning the entries with astonishing speed. Then he stopped. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. Holmes tapped a particular line. "3 days ago, Mr. Carstairs purchased an item from a private collector." Lestrade leaned closer. "What item?" Holmes read aloud. "An ornamental lock mechanism. Origin unknown." Lestrade blinked. "A lock." Holmes slowly withdrew the silver key from his pocket. "Precisely. The connection struck me at once. You believe the key belongs to the missing lock?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "I believe, Watson, that our mysterious correspondent wished Mr. Carstairs to possess that lock, just long enough for the key to become significant." Lestrade scratched his chin. "You're saying someone set this whole thing up?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "A carefully arranged puzzle." He began moving about the shop again, inspecting various objects. Suddenly, he stopped beside a small glass display. Case. Inside lay an assortment of rare coins. Holmes crouched low and studied the floor beneath a cabinet. "Lestrade," he said quietly. "Yes." "Come here." The inspector joined us. Holmes pointed toward a faint mark in the dust. "A footprint." Lestrade squinted. "Looks ordinary enough." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, it is quite remarkable." "How so?" Holmes gestured toward the heel of the print. "Notice the triangular indentation." Lestrade stared at it. "So?" Holmes stood. "That indentation is caused by a nautical boot nailotype, commonly used by sailors." Lestrade folded his arms. "You?" Said earlier, the parcel not looked like a sailor's work. Holmes nodded double quotes, and now we find a sailor's footprint at the scene of the crime. Case closed then, Lestrade declared. We find the sailor, and we find the murderer. Holmes' expression remained calm. My dear Lestrade, if our adversary truly wished us to believe a sailor was responsible, could he have arranged a more obvious clue? The inspector groaned, meaning, it's another trick. Precisely, Holmes returned to the counter and examined the chalk. Outline once more. There is something else, he murmured. He crouched low and inspected the floorboards carefully. Watson, look here. Between two planks lay a tiny object. Holmes lifted it delicately. It was a fragment of blue glass, no larger than a fingernail, from a bottle. I suggested. Holmes shook his head. Too thick. He held it to the light. Colored optical glass. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Holmes slipped the fragment into his pocket. It means our adversary is not merely staging crimes, and Holmes looked toward the foggy street beyond the window. He is conducting experiments. Lestrade stared at him. Experiments with murder? Holmes gave a slow nod. Before anyone could speak again, one of the constables entered the shop hurriedly. Inspector? Yes, a messenger just arrived. Lestrade frowned. What sort of messenger? The constable handed him a sealed envelope. Lestrade tore it open. Inside lay a second card. Holmes stepped forward. Read it. Lestrade's voice grew uneasy. It says, the second gift awaits. Holmes extended his hand, and the rest. Lestrade turned the card over. A single address had been written. Beneath the message, Holmes read it silently. Then he sighed. Just as I feared. What is it now? Lestrade demanded. Holmes slipped the card into his pocket. It appears, he said calmly, that our opponent has already chosen the location of the next crime. Lestrade's face tightened. Where? Holmes looked toward the door. Whitechapel. The inspector swore under his breath. Holmes' voice grew grave. And unless we reach it in time. He glanced once more at the silver key. Another man will die before the second gift arrives. Within half an hour of receiving the mysterious card, Holmes had summoned a hansom cab, and we were racing eastward through the thickening fog toward Whitechapel. The atmosphere of London had grown darker and more oppressive as the day progressed, and the narrow streets of the East End seemed swallowed by mist and shadow. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin while the silver key rested between them, glinting faintly in the dim light. I had seen that expression many times before, the calm surface masking the rapid machinery of his mind. Watson, he said suddenly, breaking a long silence, our adversary is not merely committing murder. He is constructing a sequence. A sequence, I repeated. Yes, each crime is a step, each object a clue, and each victim a piece placed deliberately upon the board. You mean this is some kind of game? Holmes' thin lips formed a faint smile. A game of intellect. Watson, and a very dangerous one. Inspector Lestrade leaned forward impatiently from the corner of the carriage. Holmes, you already know the rules of this game. Perhaps you'd care to explain them before another man turns up dead. Holmes turned the silver key slowly between his fingers. The first gift was a key, he said quietly. A key implies a lock. A lock implies a door. And a door implies something hidden behind it. Lestrade frowned. And what does that have to do with Whitechapel? Holmes gazed out the fogged carriage window toward the dim glow of gas lamps passing in the street. I believe, he said slowly, that our enemy wishes to lead us somewhere. The carriage halted abruptly. The driver opened the door. We're here, gentlemen. Whitechapel greeted us with a chill wind and the distant murmur of restless voices. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance of a narrow alleyway, their hushed whispers filling the damp air. 2 policemen were attempting to hold them back. Lestrade pushed forward immediately. "Scotland Yard." "Let us through." Holmes and I followed him into the alley. Even before I saw the body, I sensed something terribly wrong. The victim lay against the brick wall, as though he had simply collapsed while walking. His coat was still buttoned, his hat resting beside him upon the ground. There were no wounds, no blood, nothing. But the strange expression frozen upon his face. Holmes crouched beside the body without hesitation. I shall never forget the look on the dead man's features. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth slightly open as if he had attempted to cry out, before death silenced him forever. Lestrade spoke quietly. "Second one today." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he began examining the victim with slow, deliberate care. His fingers moved across the man's coat, his pockets, the ground surrounding him. "What is the man's name?" Holmes asked. "Thomas Berridge," Lestrade replied. "Dock worker. Lives nearby." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "A laborer, then." Stood and began studying the walls of the alley. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then Holmes pointed toward the brickwork near the victim's shoulder. "Watson, do you observe that mark?" I leaned closer. Upon the wall was a faint circular stain, barely visible in the fog-damp bricks. "What is it?" Holmes lifted his magnifying lens. "A residue? Of what?" Holmes sniffed the air carefully. "Chloroform, and something far more interesting." "What?" "An experimental compound." Lestrade groaned. "Holmes, for heaven's sake, speak plainly." Holmes turned toward him. "Our adversary is using chemistry." "Poison?" "Not exactly." Holmes glanced again at the corpse. "If I am correct, the victim died not from poison, but from terror itself." Lestrade blinked. "That's impossible." Holmes' voice remained calm. "Extreme shock can stop the heart instantly. A sufficiently terrifying stimulus would achieve precisely that result." "But what terrified him?" I asked. Holmes gestured toward the fog-filled alley. "That is precisely what we must discover." He then examined the ground carefully. A moment later, he smiled faintly. "Ah, what now?" Lestrade muttered. Holmes pointed to the cobblestones. Another footprint lay there, the same nautical boot nail pattern we had seen in Carstairs' shop. Lestrade folded his arms triumphantly. "There it is again, our sailor." Holmes shook his head. "My dear Lestrade, our adversary is clearly guiding us toward this conclusion. That alone proves it false." Lestrade sighed heavily. "Then what does it prove?" Holmes stood slowly. "That we are exactly where he wants us." At that moment, a constable approached hurriedly. "Inspector, Surtheis was found near the body," handed Lestrade a small envelope. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Another gift." Lestrade opened the envelope and removed a folded piece of paper. Inside was a second, silver key. But this one was different. The metal was stained faintly blue. Attached to it was another tag. Holmes took it from Lestrade and read aloud. "The second gift." Beneath the message was a second line written in the same careful hand. Holmes read it silently. His expression changed. "Well?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes slipped the key into his pocket. "It appears our adversary grows impatient." "What does the message say?" Holmes looked toward the dark end of the alley, where the fog thickened like a living thing. "It says," he replied quietly, "the third gift will be personal." A cold sensation passed through me. "What does that mean?" Holmes' eyes met mine. "For the first time in this case," he said slowly, "I believe the next victim may not be chosen at random." Lestrade frowned. "You mean someone specific?" Holmes nodded. Double quotes. "Yes, And who would that be? Holmes gave a faint, humorless smile. My dear Inspector, if our enemy wishes to make the game truly interesting— He paused. He may choose someone close to me. The fog drifted silently through the alley, and for the first time since the case began, I felt the distinct impression that we were no longer merely investigating a crime. We were being hunted. When we returned to Baker Street that evening, the oppressive fog of London seemed heavier than before, as though the entire city had been wrapped in a shroud of uncertainty. Holmes went directly to the sitting room without removing his coat, his expression thoughtful and unusually grave. I had seen my friend face criminals of the most dangerous and brilliant kind. Yet something in this case disturbed him in a manner I could not immediately explain. The 2 silver keys rested upon the table before him, their polished surfaces reflecting the glow of the fireplace as though they possessed some silent significance beyond their simple appearance. Holmes stood over them for several moments without speaking, his thin fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table while his eyes examined the keys, with the same penetrating focus I had seen him use when studying the smallest detail of a crime. Seen at last, he sat down slowly and drew the lamp closer. The yellow light fell directly upon the keys, revealing details I had not noticed before: delicate engravings along the shaft, faint scratches near the handle, and the strange bluish stain that marked the second key which had been delivered at Whitechapel. Holmes lifted the first key and turned it carefully between his fingers while I watched in silence. His mind, I knew, was assembling observations into a pattern, yet the pattern itself remained hidden from me. After a long pause, he spoke quietly, almost as though addressing his own thoughts rather than mine. He remarked that criminals often reveal themselves not through what they hide, but through the structure of the clues they choose to present. In this particular instance, the gifts were clearly not random objects. Each key represented a step. The fact that they had been delivered alongside 2 mysterious deaths suggested a deliberate progression, like the stages of some carefully arranged puzzle. Holmes then placed the first key beside the second and compared them, again beneath the magnifying lens. Although they appeared nearly identical in shape, he pointed out subtle differences in their construction, which indicated they had been manufactured at different times but designed to belong to the same mechanism. The idea fascinated him, and as he explained his reasoning, it became clear that the keys must belong to a set, most likely connected to some form of antique locking device. Holmes believed it was highly probable that Edward Carstairs, the antique dealer whose death had begun the case, had recently acquired such a device without realizing its true importance. The murderer, or rather the architect of this strange sequence of events, had ensured that the keys would reach Holmes only after Carstairs and the unfortunate dock worker had already been killed. In other words, the gifts were not clues left behind by accident. They were invitations. Holmes leaned back in his chair and stared thoughtfully into the fire while I considered the implications of this theory. If the keys belonged to a single mechanism, then somewhere in London there existed a lock designed to receive them. Yet why would anyone orchestrate 2 murders merely to guide Holmes towards such a discovery? The question troubled me deeply, and I voiced my concern that our adversary might be attempting something far more elaborate than a simple crime. Holmes agreed with this assessment, but suggested that the true purpose of the game would only become clear once the third key appeared. According to his reasoning, the killer wished to create anticipation, forcing Holmes to follow the chain of clues step by step until the final stage of the puzzle revealed itself. It was at that moment that Mrs. Hudson entered the room carrying a newly delivered letter. The envelope bore the same careful handwriting that had appeared on the previous messages, and Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly as he recognized it. Without haste, he opened the letter and read the contents silently. I noticed a faint tightening of his expression before he handed the page to me. The message was brief, yet unsettling. It stated that 2 gifts had already been delivered and that 1 more would follow before the door could be opened. Beneath these words was a single sentence written with almost theatrical precision. When the 3rd key arrives, the truth will finally belong to you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes took the letter back and placed it beside the keys upon the table. For several moments he said nothing, but the intensity of his gaze suggested that some important realization had just formed in his mind. Finally, he spoke in a calm but unmistakably serious tone, explaining that our adversary had now made his intention perfectly clear. The 3 keys were meant to open something hidden, something the sender wished Holmes himself to discover. However, there was an additional implication that troubled him greatly. If 2 deaths had already accompanied the first 2 keys, then it was almost certain that the 3rd key would be delivered only after another crime had taken place. The murderer was not merely presenting a puzzle. He was constructing a chain of events in which each step required another victim. The fire crackled softly as Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing out into the fog-covered street below. His silhouette stood motionless against the glass while the dim lights of Baker Street flickered in the mist outside. When he finally turned back toward me, the expression on his face had changed. There was determination there, but also a trace of something I rarely saw in him: concern. He admitted quietly that the next stage of the game might not involve a stranger chosen at random. If the pattern continued as he suspected, the next move would be designed to force him into action more directly. Our opponent, whoever he might be, had already proven that he possessed both intelligence and patience. And such a man would inevitably seek a way to make the challenge personal. Holmes then returned to the table and gathered the keys into his hand. The small pieces of silver glinted in the lamplight as though they possessed some hidden life of their own. After a moment, he placed them carefully inside a drawer of his desk and locked it. Turning to me, he remarked that the most dangerous aspect of the situation was not the murders themselves, but the mind responsible for them. A criminal who desired only wealth or revenge could usually be anticipated. But a man who committed crimes simply to test another man's intellect was capable of almost anything. As Holmes extinguished the lamp and prepared to retire for the night, I could not help feeling that the fog outside our window concealed more than the ordinary darkness of London. Somewhere within that vast and restless city, a brilliant and calculating enemy was preparing the 3rd gift. And when it arrived, the true purpose of the game would finally begin to reveal itself. The following morning broke over London with the same oppressive fog that had hung above the city for several days. Though to my mind, the atmosphere within Baker Street felt far heavier than anything the weather alone could explain. Holmes had risen early and had already been awake for several hours when I entered the sitting room. I found him seated at the breakfast table with a collection of maps spread before him, each carefully marked with small pencil circles around the locations connected to the case. Edward Carstairs' antique shop in Bloomsbury and the Narrow Alley Inn, Whitechapel, where the dock worker had died, were both marked upon the map. And Holmes appeared to be measuring the distance between them with a thin brass ruler. The 2 silver keys lay beside the map, reflecting the pale morning light that filtered weakly through the fog outside the window. Holmes greeted me absently as I entered, though it was evident his mind was still deeply occupied with the puzzle before him. As he explained his reasoning, it became clear that he had spent much of the night considering the geographic pattern formed by the crimes. The first murder had occurred in a respectable district associated with trade and antiquities, while the second had taken place in the rougher quarters of Whitechapel among the working class. Holmes believed this contrast was deliberate rather than accidental. Whoever orchestrated the crimes wished to move across London in stages, perhaps drawing a symbolic path through the city itself. When I asked whether he had discovered any clear pattern linking the 2 locations, Holmes admitted that the connection remained incomplete. According to the letter we had received, the 3rd key would appear soon, and it was almost certain that another death would accompany it. until that event occurred. The pattern would remain unfinished. Our conversation was interrupted by a firm knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered the room, carrying a small wooden box upon a tray. And I noticed at once that Holmes' expression sharpened as soon as he saw it. The box was identical to the one that had contained the first key, wrapped carefully in the same brown paper, and tied with the same black twine. Mrs. Hudson informed us that a young messenger boy had delivered it only moments earlier and had disappeared into the fog before she could ask any questions. Holmes thanked her calmly and waited until she had left the room before approaching the table. The silence in the room seemed almost tangible as he studied the parcel. For a moment, he simply stood there, his long fingers resting lightly upon the wrapping as though he were weighing the significance of what lay inside. At last, he untied the string and opened the box. Inside lay the third silver key. Unlike the previous two, this one bore a faint reddish stain along its shaft, as though the metal had been touched by something far darker than the chemical residue we had seen earlier. Attached to the key was a small card bearing the same careful handwriting that had appeared on the previous messages. Holmes read the note silently and then handed it to me. The message was simple yet chilling in its implication. The third gift has arrived. Now the door may be opened. Beneath these words was a final instruction that caused Holmes' eyes to narrow thoughtfully. The note contained the address of an abandoned warehouse along the Thames, not far from the docks. Holmes examined the key carefully under his magnifying lens while I considered the meaning of the message. If his earlier theory was correct, the three keys together would open some hidden mechanism located within that warehouse. The thought that our adversary had deliberately led us there, through a chain of murders, filled me with a growing sense of unease. Holmes appeared to share this concern, though he expressed it in his usual calm manner. He pointed out that the criminal had now completed the sequence of gifts exactly as promised. The next step, therefore, would almost certainly involve the locked object itself. Whatever lay hidden behind that mysterious door had been the true objective from the beginning. Yet Holmes remained cautious. He remarked that a mind capable of designing such a complex sequence would not reveal its purpose without arranging a final test. The warehouse might contain the answer to the entire mystery, but it might also conceal a trap intended to challenge him directly. The adversary behind these events had demonstrated an unusual fascination with Holmes' intellect, and it seemed increasingly likely that the entire affair had been orchestrated not merely as a crime, but as a confrontation between two calculating minds. Not within an hour, Holmes had gathered his coat and prepared to leave for the address written on the card. As we stepped into the foggy street outside Baker Street, he paused briefly and glanced back toward the window of our sitting room. I noticed that his expression had become unusually serious. He admitted quietly that although the game was approaching its conclusion, the most dangerous moment was still ahead. Somewhere inside that abandoned warehouse lay the mechanism designed to accept the three keys. And once it was opened, the identity and motives of our mysterious adversary would finally be revealed. Holmes placed the three silver keys securely inside his pocket and signaled for a cab. As we drove toward the river through the silent streets of London, I could not shake the feeling that the final stage of the puzzle was already waiting for us in the shadows. The fog thickened as we approached the docks, and the dark outline of warehouses loomed along the Thames like silent witnesses to the crimes that had brought us there. Whatever secret the keys were meant to unlock, Holmes was now closer to discovering it than ever. Beforehand, the man who had designed this elaborate challenge was undoubtedly waiting for that moment to arrive. The cab carried us steadily through the mist-laden streets until the familiar bustle of central London faded behind us and the grim silhouettes of the riverside. Warehouses began to appear through the fog. The Thames lay somewhere beyond the darkened buildings, though the river itself could not be seen. Only the low groan of distant ships and the slow lapping of water against the docks betrayed its presence. Holmes remained unusually silent throughout the journey, his long frame leaning slightly forward in the cab, as though his mind were already exploring the building we were about to enter. I knew that silence well. It meant that his thoughts were racing far ahead of the moment, assembling possibilities and anticipating dangers long before they appeared. When the cab finally stopped, we found ourselves before a narrow lane that ended at a large brick warehouse whose upper windows were black with neglect. The structure appeared long abandoned, its wooden doors warped by years of damp air drifting from the river. Holmes paid the driver and stepped down into the fog without hesitation, drawing his coat closer about him as he studied the building's entrance. A rusted iron lantern hung crookedly above the door, swaying slightly in the wind, while the surrounding walls were marked by old water stains and peeling paint. It was precisely the sort of forgotten place where a clever criminal might conceal something important without attracting attention. Holmes approached the entrance slowly, his eyes examining every inch of the door and its frame. The heavy wooden panels were secured by a thick iron lock that appeared remarkably well maintained compared to the rest of the building. I noticed immediately that the lock possessed 3 separate keyholes, arranged vertically along a brass plate that gleamed faintly beneath the lantern's light. The sight caused Holmes to pause for a moment, and I could see a faint spark of satisfaction in his eyes. The 3 keys had indeed been intended for this door. Before attempting to unlock it, Holmes carefully inspected the ground around the entrance. The damp soil near the threshold bore several footprints, though the fog and moisture had blurred them enough to make detailed analysis difficult. Nevertheless, Holmes crouched beside them for several moments, tracing their outlines with the tip of his cane. He observed that the marks appeared relatively fresh, suggesting that someone had visited the warehouse recently, perhaps even within the last few hours. That observation alone was enough to confirm our suspicion that the architect of this strange game expected us to arrive. Holmes then rose and turned toward me with a thoughtful expression. He remarked quietly that the entire case had been designed with remarkable precision. The murders, the keys, the messages each step had guided us inevitably toward this single location. Whoever stood behind the events had not merely wished to hide something inside the warehouse. He had wanted Holmes himself to be the one who discovered it. The realization carried a faint but unmistakable challenge within it, and I could see that Holmes was both intrigued and cautious. At last he removed the 3 silver keys from his pocket and examined them once more beneath the lantern's dim glow. For a moment he held them silently in his hand, as though weighing the significance of the act he was about to perform. It struck me then that this was the very object Holmes had referred to as the gift he was afraid to open. Not because of any physical danger the door might conceal, but because of what the truth behind it might reveal about the mind that had orchestrated such an elaborate puzzle. Holmes inserted the first key into the upper lock and turned it slowly. The mechanism responded with a heavy metallic click that echoed faintly through the silent alley. He then placed the second key into the middle lock and turned it with equal care. A second, deeper sound followed, as though some hidden system within the door had begun to shift into place. The fog seemed to press closer around us while he reached for the third key, and I could not help feeling that we were standing at the threshold of something far more complicated than a simple criminal hiding place. When Holmes finally inserted the third key and turned it, the entire lock released with a dull, grinding sound. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the heavy door moved inward, slightly of its own weight, revealing a narrow corridor swallowed by darkness. A faint odor of dust and old timber drifted outward from within the building, carrying with it the unmistakable stillness of a place long undisturbed. Holmes pushed the door open fully and stepped just inside the entrance while I followed close behind him. The interior of the warehouse was vast and shadowy, its high wooden beams disappearing into darkness above. Broken crates and abandoned cargo lay scattered across the floor, suggesting that the building had once been used for storage many years ago. Yet, despite its neglected appearance, something about the place felt strangely deliberate, though the emptiness itself had been arranged for a purpose. Holmes lit a small lantern he had brought with him and raised it slowly, allowing the warm circle of light to spread across the floorboards. As the glow moved through the darkness, it revealed a large wooden table standing in the center of the warehouse. Upon the table rested a single object, a small black chest, polished to a mirror-like sheen and secured with an intricate brass lock. Holmes stopped, several steps away from it, for the first time since we had begun the case. I saw genuine hesitation cross his face. He turned slightly toward me and spoke in a quiet voice that carried an unusual weight of certainty. "This, Watson," he said slowly, "is the reason for the keys. Our mysterious adversary has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that I would be the one standing here now. Whatever lies within that chest is the true answer to the entire affair." He paused briefly before continuing, "And I suspect it may also reveal the identity of the man who arranged it." The lantern light flickered across the polished surface of the chest as Holmes stepped closer. The brass lock gleamed faintly in the darkness, awaiting the keys that had been delivered through such a deadly sequence of events. As I watched Holmes reach toward it, a strange feeling settled in my mind, the sense that the puzzle was about to reach its final stage, and that whatever truth awaited inside that chest had been carefully prepared for Holmes alone. Holmes stood motionless for several moments before the small black chest that rested upon the solitary table in the center of the abandoned warehouse. The lantern light flickered across its polished surface, casting shifting reflections upon the dusty floorboards and the high wooden beams above us. The silence inside the building was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the Thames outside and the occasional creak of old timber responding to the damp air. I had seen Holmes confront danger many times before, yet there was something in his manner at that moment which suggested that the significance of this chest extended beyond the mere conclusion of a criminal investigation. It represented the final move in a carefully designed game, and Holmes alone had been chosen to play it. Slowly, he removed the 3 silver keys from his pocket and held them briefly in the light, studying them once more as though hoping they might reveal some final secret before the lock was opened. The keys had guided us through a sequence of murders and cryptic messages, and now their purpose stood directly before us. Holmes selected the smallest of the 3 and inserted it into the brass lock upon the chest. The key turned with surprising ease, producing a soft metallic click that echoed faintly through the vast emptiness of the warehouse. For a moment, Holmes did nothing further. Instead, he examined the chest carefully, running his long fingers along the edges and hinges with the same meticulous attention he applied to every detail of a crime scene. At last, he lifted the lid. Inside the chest lay no treasure, no weapon, and no object of immediate value. Instead, resting neatly within the velvet-lined interior was a single envelope sealed with dark red wax. The seal bore an unfamiliar crest-stylized raven with outstretched wings. Holmes picked up the envelope and studied it for a moment before breaking the seal and unfolding the letter inside. His eyes moved rapidly across the page as he read, for the first time since I had known him. Holmes' expression changed in a way I found deeply unsettling. It was not fear exactly, but rather the recognition of a mind equal to his own. Without speaking, he handed the letter to me, and I read the message that had been written in the same elegant hand we had seen before. The writer congratulated Holmes on solving the puzzle of the 3 keys and reaching the warehouse exactly as expected. The murders, he explained, had not been committed out of greed or revenge, but as demonstrations proof that London's greatest detective could still be manipulated by a sufficiently clever adversary. The writer went on to claim that every step of the investigation had been predicted in advance. From Holmes' inspection of the antique dealer's shop to his eventual arrival at the very table where the chest now stood. What disturbed me most, however, was the final sentence of the letter. "You have opened the gift at last, Mr. Holmes. Now turn around." The moment I finished reading those words, Holmes raised his lantern slightly and glanced toward the far end of the warehouse. Emerging slowly from the shadows between the towering stacks of abandoned crates was a tall, slender figure dressed in a dark coat. The man walked forward with calm confidence, his footsteps echoing softly across the empty floor as he approached the circle of lantern light, even before his face became fully visible. I could sense from Holmes' stillness that he had already recognized the man. The stranger stopped a few yards away and inclined his head politely, as though greeting an old acquaintance. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice that was smooth and controlled. I trust the puzzle proved sufficiently entertaining. Holmes regarded him with a calm yet piercing gaze. There was no sign of anger in his expression, only the sharp curiosity that appeared whenever he encountered a mind capable of challenging his own. He remarked quietly that the elaborate chain of clues had indeed been ingenious, though the murders involved suggested a certain moral deficiency in the author of the scheme. The man smiled faintly at this observation. "Moral considerations," he replied, "often interfere with intellectual pursuits. You, of all people, must appreciate the purity of a problem solved through logic alone." As the stranger stepped closer, the lantern light finally revealed his features clearly. He was a man of refined appearance, with pale, thoughtful eyes and an air of quiet confidence that suggested both intelligence and arrogance. Holmes watched him carefully, and after a moment he spoke a single name with calm certainty: "Professor Adrian Faulkner." The man bowed slightly, confirming the identification without surprise. He explained that he had followed Holmes' work for many years with great interest, and had long wondered whether the celebrated detective truly possessed the intellectual superiority attributed to him. The series of keys and murders had been designed as an experiment, carefully constructed challenge intended to test Holmes' deductive abilities. Each stage of the puzzle had been planned months in advance, ensuring that Holmes would be drawn inevitably toward this final confrontation. As Faulkner spoke, Holmes listened without interrupting, though I could see that his mind was already analyzing the situation. The professor had clearly expected admiration for his elaborate scheme. Yet Holmes seemed more interested in the practical details that had made it possible at last. Holmes replied in a calm voice that carried a subtle note of triumph. "The difficulty with intellectual games of this sort," he said, "is that they often require the participation of other people who may not share the same enthusiasm." Faulkner's smile faltered slightly. Holmes gestured toward the warehouse entrance behind. You see," he continued, "while you have been explaining your admirable experiment, I have been waiting for the arrival of Inspector Lestrade." At that exact moment, the heavy door of the warehouse swung open behind us, and the echo of approaching footsteps filled the vast room. The game, it seemed, had finally reached its end. The heavy echo of footsteps that followed Holmes' words rolled through the vast emptiness of the warehouse like distant thunder. The sound came steadily closer as several figures emerged through the open doorway, their lanterns casting long, wavering beams of light across the wooden floor. At their head was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his narrow face wearing an expression of grim determination as he advanced into the building with two uniformed officers close behind him. The sudden arrival of the police transformed the atmosphere of the room at once. What had moments earlier been an eerie confrontation between two calculating minds now carried the unmistakable tension of an arrest about to take place. Professor Adrian Faulkner remained remarkably composed as he observed the newcomers. He did not attempt to flee, nor did he appear particularly surprised by their presence. Instead, he folded his hands behind his back and regarded Holmes with a faint expression of admiration that bordered almost upon amusement. It was clear that even now he viewed the entire situation as the final stage of an intellectual contest, rather than the collapse of a criminal enterprise. Holmes, however, seemed far less interested in the theatrical aspects of the moment. His attention remained fixed upon Faulkner. With the quiet intensity of a man who had already completed the final steps of a difficult calculation, Lestrade approached briskly and halted beside Holmes. Glancing first at the open chest upon the table and then at the tall figure standing calmly before it, Holmes introduced the professor with characteristic brevity, explaining that Faulkner had been responsible for arranging the chain of events that had led to the deaths of Edward Carstairs and the unfortunate dock worker in Whitechapel. Lestrade's expression hardened immediately at this revelation, and he stepped forward with the air of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. Yet Faulkner merely inclined his head politely, as though acknowledging an introduction at a formal gathering rather than a charge of murder. Holmes then began to explain the reasoning that had led him to identify Faulkner as the architect of the case. Throughout the investigation, he said, several details had suggested that the crimes were not the work of an ordinary murderer. The careful design of the keys, the deliberate sequence of clues, and the intellectual tone of the messages all indicated a mind more interested in constructing a logical puzzle than in committing violence for its own sake. Holmes had therefore begun searching among individuals whose professions required both intelligence and patience. Faulkner, a former lecturer in mathematics and mechanical engineering who had recently disappeared from academic circles after a series of professional disputes, matched the profile with remarkable precision. More importantly, Holmes continued, the mechanism of the three-key lock itself revealed a distinctive style of engineering that Faulkner had once described in a technical paper published several years earlier. That paper had proposed the use of sequential locking systems as demonstrations of mathematical probability and logical progression. The moment Holmes recognized the design upon the warehouse door, he had suspected that the case might lead directly to the professor. Rather than confronting Faulkner immediately, however, Holmes had chosen to allow the final stage of the puzzle to unfold, confident that the mastermind behind the scheme would wish to witness the moment. When his challenge was solved, Faulkner listened to this explanation with quiet fascination. When Holmes finished, the professor gave a small nod of approval, as though a student had successfully completed a particularly difficult examination. He admitted freely that Holmes' reasoning had been entirely correct. The murders, he said, had never been intended as acts of personal malice. They had been chosen with cold detachment as components of a demonstration evidence that even the most celebrated detective in England could be guided step by step through a chain of logic designed by another mind. The calmness with which Faulkner spoke of the victims caused Lestrade to lose patience at once. The inspector stepped forward and declared that whatever philosophical justification the professor believed he possessed would not prevent him from answering for the deaths he had caused. Faulkner regarded the officer with mild curiosity, but offered no resistance as the policeman moved to secure his wrists with handcuffs, as the officers prepared to escort the prisoner from the warehouse. Faulkner turned once more toward Holmes. His expression was thoughtful rather than bitter, and there was even a trace of admiration in his voice when he spoke. He remarked that Holmes had solved the puzzle exactly as expected, though he confessed that he had hoped the detective might require slightly more time to reach the final conclusion. Holmes responded quietly that the professor's greatest error had been assuming that the case existed purely as an intellectual exercise. The moment innocent lives were taken, the puzzle had ceased to be a game. For a brief moment, Faulkner's composure faltered. Yet he quickly recovered his calm demeanor and allowed the officers to lead him toward the door without further comment. The lantern light followed them across the vast, floor of the warehouse until their figures gradually disappeared into the thick fog outside. Holmes remained standing beside the table for several moments after they had gone, gazing thoughtfully at the empty chest that had drawn us to that place. The silence returned slowly to the building, broken only by the distant sound of the river and the fading footsteps of the police escort. At last Holmes closed the lid of the chest and extinguished the lantern. "The game," he said quietly, "is finished." Yet as we left the warehouse and stepped once more into the fog-covered streets of London, I could not help feeling that the strange case of the three keys had left a deeper impression upon Holmes than he cared to admit. The fog along the Thames had grown thicker. By the time Holmes and I stepped out of the abandoned warehouse and into the cold London night, the lanterns carried by Inspector Lestrade and his men gradually disappeared into the mist as they escorted Professor Adrian Faulkner away toward the waiting police carriage. For several moments, Holmes remained standing at the entrance of the warehouse, his tall silhouette outlined faintly by the dim light behind us. The river moved quietly in the darkness beyond the docks. The distant sounds of ships drifting along the Thames echoed softly through the fog. It was a scene both peaceful and strangely solemn, as though the city itself had paused to reflect upon the strange events that had just reached their conclusion. Holmes finally turned and began walking slowly along the cobbled road beside the river, his hands clasped behind his back in his usual thoughtful manner. I followed beside him in silence, aware that his mind was still occupied with the case we had just solved. It was not unusual for Holmes to reflect deeply after the capture of a criminal. Yet there was something different about his mood on that evening. The case of the three keys had not been a simple matter of detection. It had been a challenge carefully designed to test his intellect, and although he had ultimately prevailed, the experience had clearly left him with certain thoughts he preferred to examine privately. After several minutes, Holmes spoke quietly, almost as though continuing a conversation that had begun within his own mind. He remarked that Professor Faulkner possessed one of the most methodical and disciplined intellects he had encountered in many years. The professor's mistake, however, had been believing that intelligence alone was sufficient to justify his actions. Holmes observed that Faulkner had treated human lives as components of a theoretical problem, failing to understand that the consequences of such reasoning inevitably lead to ruin. The brilliance of his plan had therefore become the very thing that ensured his downfall. When we reached the main road and secured a cab for the journey back to Baker Street, Holmes fell silent again. The ride through London passed quietly, the fog pressing against the windows of the carriage while the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves echoed through the empty streets. I suspected that Holmes was replaying the entire sequence of events in his mind, examining each step of the puzzle as he often did after a complex case had ended. By the time we arrived at Baker Street, the lamps along the familiar row of houses burned dimly through the mist, casting warm pools of light upon the pavement. Inside the sitting room of our apartment, Mrs. Hudson had already prepared a small fire, and the comforting warmth of the room seemed to push the cold fog of the night back beyond the windows. Holmes removed his coat and settled into his armchair while I poured 2 glasses of brandy. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The quiet crackle of the fire filled the room as Holmes gazed thoughtfully into the flames. At last, I asked him a question that had been troubling me since the moment he first referred to the mysterious parcel as a gift he feared to open. Holmes smiled faintly at the memory and leaned back in his chair. He explained that the fear he had spoken of had not been the fear of physical danger. Rather, it had been the possibility that the person behind the puzzle might possess a mind capable of matching his own. Holmes admitted that he had long accepted the fact that most criminals were predictable creatures driven by greed or desperation. Faulkner, however, had approached crime as a purely intellectual exercise, constructing his scheme with the precision of a mathematician and the patience of a chess master. Such adversaries, Holmes continued, were exceedingly re-rand, therefore far more dangerous than ordinary criminals. A man who commits crimes for profit may eventually grow careless, but a man who commits them simply to prove a point is far more difficult to anticipate. For this reason, Holmes had felt a certain unease when the first key arrived at Baker Street. It suggested the presence of a mind that sought not merely to evade capture, but to engage him directly in a contest of logic. Holmes took a slow sip of brandy and then placed the glass upon the table beside him. The firelight reflected in his keen gray eyes as he spoke his final thoughts on the matter. In the end, he said, Faulkner's greatest weakness had been his desire for recognition. The professor had not been satisfied merely to design the puzzle. He had needed to witness Holmes solving it. That single flaw had allowed Holmes to predict the final meeting at the warehouse and ensure that. Lestrade arrived at the proper moment. Holmes then rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out across Baker Street where the fog drifted quietly beneath the street lamps. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, and then he gave a small shrug of indifference, as though the entire matter had already faded into the past. After all, Watson, he said calmly, even the most elaborate puzzle must eventually come to an end. With that remark, he returned to his chair and reached for the violin that rested upon the nearby table. As the first quiet notes of music filled the room, I realized that the strange and unsettling case of the three keys had finally concluded. Yet the memory of that polished black chest and the challenge it represented would remain with me for many years to come, a reminder that even the greatest detective in London could occasionally encounter a mystery designed not merely to be solved, but to test the very limits of his remarkable mind. The events surrounding Professor Adrian Faulkner and the strange puzzle of the three silver keys might have faded quietly into the long catalogue of unusual adventures I had shared with my friend Sherlock Holmes, had it not been for the peculiar impression the case left upon my mind. In the days that followed Faulkner's arrest, London returned to its usual rhythm with remarkable indifference. The newspapers reported the capture of the criminal with brief enthusiasm before turning their attention to the endless parade of smaller scandals that filled the city's pages. Yet for Holmes and myself, the affair lingered in a subtler way, like a chess match whose final move had been made but whose strategy continued to reveal itself. Upon reflection, several evenings after the case concluded, I found Holmes seated in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, surrounded by a scattered collection of newspapers and correspondence. The fire burned low in the grate, casting a soft orange glow across the room while the fog pressed silently against the windows outside. Holmes had been unusually quiet throughout the day, occasionally glancing toward the small drawer of his desk where the three silver keys had been placed for safekeeping. Their purpose had been fulfilled, yet Holmes had chosen to keep them rather than surrender them as evidence. When I asked him why he had done so, he answered with a thoughtful expression that those keys represented something far more interesting than a mere criminal artifact. Holmes explained that the case had illustrated a curious truth about the nature of intellect itself. Most criminals he encountered were driven by straightforward motives, greed, jealousy, or desperation. Their actions followed patterns that could be predicted with sufficient observation. Faulkner, however, had acted not for wealth or revenge, but for recognition. His crimes had been designed as a demonstration of intellectual superiority, a challenge constructed with the precise logic of a mathematician determined to prove a theory. Holmes admitted that such adversaries were rare, yet they posed a unique danger, precisely because they viewed human life as secondary to the elegance of their ideas. As Holmes spoke, I realized that Faulkner's elaborate puzzle had been directed not merely at the detective's reasoning, but at his pride. The keys, the messages, and the carefully staged sequence of clues had all been intended to lure Holmes into accepting the challenge. In that sense, the gifts had indeed been dangerous not because of any physical trap hidden within them, but because they appealed directly to the very qualities that made Holmes such an extraordinary detective. Faulkner had believed that Holmes would be unable to resist solving the puzzle. And in this respect, the professor had been entirely correct. Holmes leaned back in his chair and gazed thoughtfully at the fire as he continued. His explanation: "The true weakness in Faulkner's plan," he said, "had been the same flaw that afflicts many brilliant minds: the desire to witness their own success. Had the professor been satisfied merely to commit his crimes and vanish quietly, the trail might have grown cold before Holmes could identify him. Instead, Faulkner had arranged the final meeting at the warehouse. Unable to resist observing the moment when Holmes opened the chest and solved the mystery of the keys. That single decision had transformed the carefully planned demonstration into a fatal mistake." Listening to Holmes' calm analysis, I found myself reflecting upon the strange relationship between the detective and the criminals he pursued. Over the years, I had seen him confront thieves, murderers, blackmailers, and spies of every description. Yet each case seemed to reveal something new about the extraordinary machinery of his mind. Faulkner had attempted to turn that intellect into a weapon against its owner. But Holmes had ultimately used the same qualities: patience, observation, and logic to defeat him. The fire had nearly burned down to embers when Holmes finally rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking Baker Street. The fog had begun to thin slightly, and the dim glow of the street lamps reflected off the wet pavement below. For several moments he stood there in silence, his tall figure outlined against the glass while the city moved quietly beyond it. At last he spoke again, in a tone that carried a hint of quiet amusement. "You see, Watson," he said, "a puzzle is rarely as dangerous as the mind that creates it." With that remark, he turned back toward the fire and began searching through the morning's correspondence for a new case that might occupy his attention. Yet, as I watched him that evening, I could not help thinking that the strange affair of the 3 keys had revealed something deeper than the capture of a single criminal. It had shown that even the greatest detective in London might occasionally encounter an opponent capable of challenging him not with force, but with the subtle and dangerous power of intellect itself, and that, perhaps, was the true reason why the gift had once given Sherlock Holmes pause before he chose to open it. Several weeks passed after the arrest of Professor Adrian Faulkner, and the strange events surrounding the 3 silver keys gradually faded from the public memory of London. The newspapers that had once speculated wildly about the mysterious murders in Bloomsbury and Whitechapel soon found new scandals to occupy their columns, and Scotland Yard appeared quite satisfied that the case had been concluded with Faulkner's capture. To the ordinary observer, it seemed that the entire affair had ended as neatly as any criminal investigation could. Yet from my vantage point, beside my remarkable friend Sherlock Holmes, I sensed that the matter had left a deeper impression upon him than he was willing to admit. Holmes resumed his usual routine with apparent indifference. He devoted his time to smaller cases brought to Baker Street, played long passages upon his violin during quiet evenings, and occasionally vanished for hours into the streets of London when some curious observation demanded further investigation. Yet every so often I would notice his attention drift toward the drawer of his desk, where the 3 silver keys had been placed after the events at the warehouse. Though they had served their purpose in unlocking Faulkner's final challenge, Holmes had insisted upon keeping them. When I asked him about this habit one evening, he replied that objects connected with unusual crimes often possessed a certain historical value, particularly when they represented the work of an unusually methodical mind. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon that the final and most curious development occurred. The fog that had haunted London throughout the case had finally begun to lift, and a pale winter sun shone through the windows of Baker Street while Holmes and I sat, Reading in comfortable silence, Mrs. Hudson entered the room carrying the day's correspondence and placed a small stack of letters upon the table beside Holmes. Most of them proved to be routine matters requests for advice, invitations from clients, and the occasional note from Scotland Yard. Yet one envelope immediately drew Holmes' attention. The letter bore no return address and had been sealed with a dark wax stamp depicting the unmistakable crest of a raven with outstretched wings, the same symbol that had appeared upon the envelope we discovered inside the black chest at the warehouse. Holmes opened the letter. Slowly, inside was a brief message written in the same elegant handwriting that had guided us through the puzzle of the three keys. The writer explained that Professor Faulkner had been transferred to a high-security prison outside the city and would soon stand trial for the murders attributed to him. The message contained no threats, no elaborate riddles, and no further challenges. Instead, it concluded with a single statement that caused Holmes to pause thoughtfully. A problem, once solved, should never be repeated. Consider the matter closed. Holmes read the message twice before folding the letter carefully and placing it upon the table. For a moment, he appeared more intrigued than alarmed. The obvious implication was that Faulkner himself had written the note from prison, perhaps wishing to acknowledge the end of his strange intellectual contest. Yet there was one detail that Holmes pointed out immediately. The prison authorities strictly controlled all outgoing correspondence from inmates, and such a letter would almost certainly have been inspected before reaching Baker Street. This meant that someone else had delivered it. The thought did not seem to trouble Holmes as much as it intrigued him. He observed calmly that Faulkner had always admired the elegance of final gestures, and the letter was entirely consistent with that tendency. Whether it had been written by the professor or delivered by some admirer of his intellect, its purpose appeared to be simply to mark the conclusion of the strange game that had begun. With the arrival of the first key, Holmes placed the letter inside the same drawer that contained the 3 silver keys and closed it. Quietly, "The matter is finished," he said with a small shrug. That evening, as the lamps of Baker Street flickered to life outside the window and Holmes' violin filled the room with a slow, thoughtful melody, I found myself reflecting upon the extraordinary chain of events we had experienced. The puzzle of the keys had begun as a baffling mystery and ended as a confrontation between two brilliant minds, one devoted to justice, the other consumed by the cold logic of intellectual pride. As for Holmes, he seemed content to let the matter rest. The following morning he was already engaged in a new investigation, his mind moving effortlessly from one problem to the next as though the strange case of Faulkner and the keys had never occurred. Yet, even now, whenever I pass the desk in our sitting room and catch a glimpse of that small, locked drawer, I cannot help remembering the peculiar remark Holmes made on the day the first key arrived at Baker Street. It had been, he said, the only gift he had ever been uncertain whether he should open, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of his remarkable mind, he still wonders whether the puzzle truly ended when the last key turned in the lock.